Hello, everyone. I'm Charlie Masquelier. You heard me speak a minute ago. I'd like to welcome you to the Provocations panel. This panel aims to provide diverse perspectives and spark debate on environmental justice. We've got three provocateurs who will be presenting a key challenge or bold idea to get you thinking. Now, to make sure you each finish on time, presenters or provocateurs, you will hear from me at about 1 minute just before the end of your talk. You have about 10 to 15 minutes. And at the end, there will be a sort of around 20 minutes for question and answers. So let me introduce the different speakers. Firstly, Nadia Shaikh, who will be talking about recommoning and class. Nadia is a naturalist and conservationist at Right to Roam and chairs the Raven Network, a peer support group for people of color who work in the nature conservation sector. Rupert Reed, who will talk about the limits of justice, why non-human life, the future, and our task of climate adaptation all point away from overly centering justice. Rupert is co-director of the Climate Majority Project and emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's the author of several books focusing on the climate and ecological crisis. And a third provocateur, Sherilyn McGregor, will give us a provocation called Against Rewilding, a Careful Critique. Sherilyn is a professor of environmental politics at the University of Manchester and the director of the ESRC-funded Just Centre, a multi-partner social science research centre focused on sustainability transitions that are people-centred, place-based, and socially just. So Nadia, if you could, yes, start, that would be fantastic. On to you.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great, thank you.
Grand. I apologize in advance if dogs bark. I am dog sitting. Thank you all for having me along. Feel like a bit of an imposter, but here we go. I was asked to be provocative, which is something that I'm told that I am, and I'm not meaning to be. I think I just say what I see. Um, and find it hard to not um to name problems as I see them, but also deeply curious. I think I don't know whether you've seen my bio, but just and Charlie introduced it there. But I worked in nature conservation for most of my life. I'm a naturalist and ornithologist, and have recently moved on to working in land justice, and ultimately because I just kept peeling back the layers to trying to understand why it is that in a country with, so many nature conservation organizations and so many nature lovers, we and so much money and investment with kind of our biodiversity's in free fall, but also there's just a lack of people engaging with nature really in a large scale. There was um, an article out this week. Some research has been done saying that we're one of the least nature connected countries out of 61 countries, 55 out of 61. Um, so yeah, the provocation I wrote, I think really is just to name the journey that I went on, and I think it's important to ground us in the reality of um, who we are as a culture and what's happened with our people and our land. And to sum it up, really briefly, we did have a much more peopled landscape. Our countryside um, was more vibrant and diverse with people in terms of their engagement with land and how people were spread across and worked across the land. And this was a time when nature was abundant. My kind of understanding of this is that actually, when people are in the countryside, small scale farming, and had a sense of connection and belonging to it, our biodiversity was more abundant. Increasingly over millennia, we have been, I say we at large, our population has been pushed into urban environments and into wage labor, meaning that um, there is now this empty countryside largely, and then really busy urban areas. And I think it's really important to, and I'm not the kind of person that I don't just look at the past and go, do you know what we should do? We should just go to the way things were in the past. I'm certainly not doing that, and I'm certainly not an idealist, but there's a lot to understand around social justice issues and the reality of um, people's role in the crisis that we're in. Um, so now we've got to this sort of the status quo is that there is a countryside that's managed by very few people. And I think when we look at um, the nature problem from my experience, it feels easier to work with fewer landowners and fewer farmers to fix the problem than to integrate all people back into the countryside and have to deal with that many people. And I think that feels scary. Um, and I feel like there's a deep misanthropy that and fear that often drives our way of finding solutions because we have this situation now where um, we kind of almost, I think, feel sometimes like there's a blank canvas. So there's a whole bit of land there that we can just rewild by working with two or three landowners. Um, and I guess my big provocation is that actually we ought to meaningfully repeople and recommon the landscape. And whether that means more people living in the countryside or whether actually more people just having a say. I gave a talk to the National Trust Conference last year, and we wanted to understand what is the place for us now going into the countryside and green spaces and what is people's responsibility. And the idea of the perfect visitor came up, which is um, you want people to go in to the countryside for the purposes of recreation, for a day trip, to enjoy it, to behave in a certain way, maybe buy something from a gift shop, maybe go to a cafe, spend a bit of money, and then go home. And when we talk about the public and their place in the countryside, it's often caveated around this idea of this perfect person. They know how to behave, they know how to close gates, they very much can go in. And then we lament the fact that people don't know about nature or wildlife. They don't know the names of trees. They don't know the names of birds. They don't understand ecosystems. And it's often kind of grumbled about the lack of responsibility or the lack of knowledge. Um, and so, but what happens is if we genuinely want people to connect with nature and care for it, what happens is naturally is people then have a sense of belonging. This really beautiful thing happens when you start spending more time in nature. You have a sense of belonging, and when you start having a sense of belonging, you then start having a sense of responsibility and ownership. But yet we don't have the facility or the capacity to allow people to enact that sense of belonging and ownership, short of maybe giving money to a nature conservation charity. Um, and so the book really does stop there. We've kind of created this barrier that can't be crossed. I do see lots of sort of tokenistic consultations or people on boards. But the reality is that we kind of want both things, but we haven't got a system that allows it to happen. With my work within Right to Roam, we have a group called AFLO, which is Access Friendly Farmers and Landowners, who are all farmers, landowners who really support more access. And we've been working with that group for 3 years now. And they are lonely and desperate, and their solutions to their problems quite often do involve more community engagement. They want to know the people that live nearby. They want to have relationships to help them, close fences, notice things that are problems in the countryside. So then the kind of overarching narrative that some people belong here and and then they can go in and leave again. I don't think it's necessarily true from my experience. Um, and then I guess the other part of my provocation is around class. Um, and I come from a working class background, and so my understanding of class and how it works is that there are so many rules of behaviors about how you're supposed to be, and and we have this kind of horrible way of climbing ladders and pulling them up behind us, and it's a way of justifying that we are superior. This is something that humans do. We're better than them because we behave this way. And when it comes to the countryside, there is a very clear prescribed way of how we should treat the countryside or be in the countryside. And it's often associated with recreation and recreation alone. So you go into the countryside to do your activity, but then you go back to the built environment. So you go in to sort of take something from it, have a bit of respite for a day, and then leave again. Um, and that comes with a whole system of like the right gear, um, and definitely sort of coming and going, but not a deeper sense of cultural belonging. Because what does cultural belonging mean if you can't actually belong and then have a say in what happens? Um, and it's also something that I've come to recognize through my work in the Raven network when it comes to a sense of belonging. Um, I guess, yeah, the Raven Network's made up of 80 people that work in the nature and conservation sector. And over the last 5 years, has been like a big recruitment drive to get people of color to work in the nature conservation sector. But actually, um, they're not allowed to genuinely have a sense of belonging or stake in what happens, because when they bring their diversity of views within the sector, they're not heard, and there's a sense of gaslighting until they're pushed to leave the sector. This is something I've recognized over the last 5 years. Um, and so I guess similarly to like class, um, there is this kind of prescribed that the overarching kind of prescription of way of saving nature and being in the countryside is just so overwhelmingly big, that narrative, that I guess I'm just going to go back and look at my provocation in my notes. Um, yeah, I guess it's so heavily coded how we're supposed to be these responsible beings that go in and then have to leave again. But I think it goes quite far. And I think ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to say is that um, I do think that misanthropy lives and breathes and dictates how we look at nature restorations and solutions. Um, and there is a lack of belief ultimately at the core that we need to have grace for people, to have trust for people in all of their diversity, and genuinely have meaningful solutions that involve communities at a grassroots level to have a say and to have a stake. And I know systemically we're not necessarily set up because of systems of land ownership. Um, but I guess ultimately my provocation is that this idea that it is an unpeopled landscape. There are certain ways of being in the landscape, which is to go in it and come out again. Um, and the lack of people really is the solution. I guess it can't be. And my proof for that is that everybody here listening, I think you trust yourselves to go into nature, be responsible, and to be the people that have a say in how we can um, like you trust yourselves, and I guess everybody else in this room to be the people that have a say. And if you trust yourselves, then we do have to trust all people. Every single person I know that's working in this sector is doing it because they've engaged with it and they love it. And I don't see why we can't see that is possible, therefore, for every human. And that should be a driving force for our work. And the examples of where real actual change for nature is happening is because of individuals, often when it's not their job. So examples are, well, we've only got access to 3% of rivers in England. One of the rivers that has long-standing access and celebrated access is the River Wye. So there's a huge group called Friends of the River Wye, who have been working and pushing to stop pollution of the River Wye. That's because people have had access to it. They have a sense of belonging. They visit it regularly and they're restoring it. Again, Friends of Ilkley Moor and Friends of the River Wharfe, hugely successful groups of people in the community who have a sense of belonging and in a place. Ilkley Moor, of course, is part of our Crow access land, therefore people can access it. And it's these grassroots movements of people doing real things for nature on the ground, which are doing extraordinary things built from the grassroots. And I want to believe that that's how we're going to solve the problems that we've got. Yet, with the kind of misanthropy that hangs over the sector, um, I think that's where there's work to do, which is caring for and loving people again, back to being able to have agency and actually do things. Bit rambling, as my thoughts always are. But ultimately, yeah, they're my little provocations for today.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you so much. Really interesting. And, the notion of class as not just an economic category, but something that's cultural, is very much speaks to me as a sociologist anyway, but we can maybe potentially discuss that later on. So a big thank you to you, Nadia. Now on to Rupert, please.
Hi, folks. Great to be here at this important event. It feels important. It feels important partly because what you're trying to do here, which as I understand it, is very much to take nature and biodiversity seriously, right? That's built into the very title of what you're trying to do. So I do have quite a bold provocation in relation to that, which is that my claim is that environmental justice or climate justice is itself a deeply problematic concept, at least if it is extended beyond its proper zone of use. And I feel that here too, at this Renew event, there is such overextension going on. So let me explain why I think that. So I'm here to talk about the limits of justice, why non-human life and the future, I mean the future of human life, and our task of adaptation to a dire situation all point away from over-reliance on the concept of justice to guide our actions. The frame of justice is pretty hegemonic in our fields and movements, also arguably in politics. It seems impossible to resist. I would go so far as to claim that we're kind of obsessed with it as human beings in this modern age. Why are we so obsessed with the frame of justice? Well, let me make another provocative claim. I think we're so obsessed with it because we're obsessed with ourselves. We are obsessed with ourselves, and that is part of the problem. That is part of the problem you are here to address. And if I'm right in that claim, then continuing that obsession cannot be an effective way of dealing with the problem, the more than problem that you are trying to address. Don't get me wrong, of course, justice is important in its place. We're obsessed with it, if you will, to some extent for a good reason. And of course, there are contexts. Nadia's sort of touched on one or two of them already. Contexts such as where we're thinking about concepts such as class or race, where the concept of justice is arguably unavoidably important. And one of the claims I'm making is that what we shouldn't do is project from that to the claim, which I think is wrong, that therefore let's just use the concept of justice to essentially deal with everything. And one of the reasons I think we are inclined to do that is because we have become, especially those of us who are more or less progressive in our politics, which probably includes a high percentage of people on this webinar, we have been sucked into this idea of intersectional identity politics and thinking that that is primary for thinking about, well, everything in terms of politics and what we ought to do. And part of my claim is that that is a hopeless basis for thinking about the more than human, for thinking about, for example, biodiversity. To anticipate a little bit more what I'm going to argue in the remainder of my time, I want to say that when you think of a term such as nature justice or biodiversity justice, well, you're kind of thinking oxymoronically. And I put it to you that when you hear the phrase nature justice or biodiversity justice, your initial response, and I think it's a good response, is what does that even mean? And it just sounds weird. And it sounds weird for a reason. The term, the idea of climate justice does make some sense. It does work, but only in specific contexts. It works, for example, with regard to thinking about certain aspects of the way in which some classes and races have suffered climate injustice, and that needs to be righted. But that is only one part of the climate field. And the same is true if we extend to environmental justice more generally, right? For example, in the United States, often Black communities have felt the brunt more of environmental pollution, and that's a matter of environmental injustice. but it's not going to help us figure out how we ought to relate to squirrels. It's not going to help us figure out what we ought to do in terms of landscape rewilding, or whether we ought to do it or not. There are numerous things where it just isn't going to be very helpful as a frame. So as I say, you are here, as I understand it, to take nature and biodiversity seriously, not to contribute collectively to our ongoing self-obsession, not to contribute to anthropocentrism, which is the problem, not the solution. So my claim is that the frame of justice is pretty hegemonic in our fields and movements, and this is a serious problem, because what if framing everything in terms of justice risks leaving out nature, leaving out non-human life? I suggest that it basically obviously does. The concept of justice was designed with present-day humans in mind, and that remains its home, away from which it struggles or misfires. But what then is the possible alternative to the justice frame? An alternative that is nature-friendly, hospitable to life at large, and hospitable to the further future, where once we are considering non-existent beings, justice and rights are just not adequate as frames to capture much at all of the terrain. To expand on that point a little bit, my claim is that if we're thinking about excuse me, matters of environmental injustice in the present, well, then that's a frame that makes sense. But when we're thinking about, say, our great-grandchildren, let alone distant future generations 1,000 years from now, about whom we ought to think a lot more than we do, then the frame of justice is patently inadequate. It's patently inadequate because the frame of justice is designed to deal with beings that you can essentially interact with and make decisions with in the present day. When we're dealing with beings whose very existence or otherwise depends upon our decision, who we do not know who they are at all, who depend completely in some vital sense on the decisions that we make, the frame of justice misleads us. So what's the alternative to the frame of justice, which I'm saying is inadequate to capturing our relations with nature and inadequate to capturing our relations with the further future, including humans in the further future? Well, the best alternative, as I've argued extensively in print in the past, is care or love. I don't have to say huge amounts about this because luckily the next speaker, Sherilyn, is going to go into it in more detail than I am. So she and I are almost doing an accidental double act here. Although I'm not here to say that she'll necessarily agree with everything I'm saying. But yeah, that's what I think. The best alternative is care or love, and it reaches far and offers much. For the figure of a judge or jury, which is prototypical of the field of justice, substitute the figure of a parent or the very different figure of a lover. An alternative to what I propose, i.e. to the care frame, an alternative to that would be to try to broaden the notion of justice so as literally to include other species. And that's what philosophers, for example, have in some cases been doing in recent years. I think this is too much of a stretch. I think this is an unfortunate and ill-motivated endeavor to try to pretend that we can take an essentially anthropocentric frame and make it ecocentric or biocentric. There might possibly be something to be said for the idea of seeking above all to be just towards dogs or dolphins. There might be something to be said for that. But if we seek to talk of being just towards mice or mushrooms or maple trees or mangrove swamps, it simply seems to me that we have lost all purchase on the notion of justice, and it is obscuring more than it can possibly reveal. Moreover, the realization that other frames besides justice are needed precisely if we are to do justice to the non-human world and to the future is particularly crucial given the age we are now tragically in, the age of climate consequences, the age of adaptation. But before I go into that, let me say a little bit more about this cute paradoxical phrase that I used just now. If we're going to do justice to the non-human world, then we need to not remain restricted to the frame of justice. To do justice to the natural world, we have precisely not to stay confined within the concept of justice. Climate justice, and remember, I haven't said that this idea of climate justice is useless. I've just said it only has one specific or one set of specific fields of reference. It shouldn't be extended beyond those. Climate justice now requires that massive attention be given to strategic and transformative adaptation. So we are tragically exiting the safe, so-called safe climate zone. We are moving beyond 1.5 degrees of average global overheat. Even Antonio Guterres has now admitted that. So we have to take adaptation and loss and damage seriously. There is no justice for those on the climate front lines in foolish and irrelevant insistences that prevention and so-called mitigation, including decarbonisation, remain what focally most matter. Nor is there any justice in merely reactive and defensive versions of climate adaptation. I'm thinking, for example, of the kind of thing that is put forward by a figure such as Richard Tice, who, if you listen carefully to him, says things like, well, the climate problem is exaggerated, it's not really that bad, and so on. But he's not straightforwardly a climate denialist anymore, and nor most definitely is Nigel Farage, because what he then goes on to say is, we can just adapt. What he means by that is things like we can build higher, hard flood defenses and look after ourselves and preserve our ongoing and so-called traditional way of life. But that is false. We have to move beyond that kind of reactive and defensive version of adaptation to embrace what in the Climate Majority Project we call strategic adaptation, as in our recent report, strategic adaptation for strategic adaptation for emergency resilience. So far, perhaps so relatively uncontroversial, but we should go further. Because of the bias that the concept of justice has on making things right, as opposed to coping and doing the best of a bad job, excessive focus on the justice frame runs the risk of occluding the vast importance of effective climate adaptation, crucially including ecosystems-based adaptation, or what are sometimes called, although I don't like the phrase very much, nature-based solutions, and crucially including helping non-human species to adapt to the swiftly changing world. A way of understanding the reality of climate breakdown is to understand that the habitable zone for many species in the UK is moving forward, is moving northward at several miles per year, which of course is very difficult for some species to adapt to. So my point there is, if you think in terms of justice, it is quite difficult not to get stuck in terms of thinking something like, we could make all of this okay, but we can't. We are now in the position of dealing with a very difficult situation, which is never going to be fixed.
1 minute. 1 minute.
Okay. As we become more collapse aware, and we realize that a vast, sprawling, unfathomable set of holocausts is pretty much definitely going to grow and remain for a long time to come, we become conscious that while justice and fairness, of course, remain important as values, what is bluntly effective in undertaking adaptation, what is effective in enabling survival, is in some ways more important. As is our sense not just of injustice, but of despoliation and ruptured love. And we realize, to conclude, we realize that utopia, the tacit or explicit telos of most justice-driven approaches, has become little more than a vapid, unhelpful distraction, and that instead what I term through-topian adaptive pathways, which make the very best of a very bad job and help us to get through what is coming, are what we are called to find and make instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for this fascinating provocation, and indeed very provocative one. Thank you very much. We'll see you in a bit. Now on to Sherilyn.
Oh, good morning. I'm going to share some slides, if I can. Right. Well, I'm going to offer a provocation and to spark some debate about rewilding. Many of you will know that rewilding is a conservation strategy that involves restoring dynamic ecosystems and introducing keystone species, and then standing back to allow nature to take care of itself. The organization called Rewilding Britain is now about 10 years old, And it's had lots of press, and there are lots of fans who see the rewilding movement as a very hopeful response to the biodiversity and climate crises. But surely it's important to ask some critical questions, especially if we are interested in environmental justice, as many of us are in this webinar, whether we agree with it, perhaps, or want to challenge it or not. But I want to think about rewilding through an ecofeminist lens, and we'll be drawing on research on rewilding that has raised some critical questions from an ecofeminist perspective to offer a careful critique. And I want to be provocative, and many will probably disagree with me, but 2 points that we might be able to agree on from the start is that rewilding is controversial, and it's still evolving in terms of what it actually achieves. Arguably, critiques like the one I'm offering have led to a lot of change in rewilding in the past decade, and to the extent that it has become more concerned with justice, I'm not against it. But whether or not existing rewilding projects lead to just outcomes, I think is very much up for debate. And I want to ask you to join me in thinking about having a debate about rewilding. A recent article in the journal Conservation Biology states that rewilding, although controversial, is increasingly presented as humanity's best hope of addressing the global biodiversity crisis. But it remains unclear how restoring non-human autonomy affects people's relationships with nature. For me, this question of people's relationships with nature is really key. As Nadia mentioned earlier, there was a report over the weekend in the paper that's found that Britain is one of the least nature-connected countries in the world. And this is, of course, really concerning because low levels of nature connectedness, along with social inequality, have been identified as major causes of biodiversity loss in this country. So looking critically at rewilding should consider what it does to promote nature connection in a just and equal way, as well as what it might be doing to devalue or prevent existing relationships that people have with the natural world that are deeply pro-environmental. So the questions I want to ask about this are from an ecofeminist perspective, and I don't have time to explain to you all that ecofeminism has to offer. I've been studying it for many, many years, 20 years or so. So a very brief explanation is that ecofeminism is a critical visionary perspective that links feminist goals for gender justice and equality with environmentalist goals for multi-species justice. It's critical of human-nature dualism and the hyper-separation that we've had, the tendency to put humans above nature. It's critical of what feminists have called the master model of mastery, the drive by some humans to control and master nature for their own benefit. And this is seen also as a root cause of the ecological crisis. And ecofeminism is critical of injustices plural, so it shares with the environmental justice movement an expansive understanding that includes issues of distribution, procedure, recognition, and epistemic injustice. Now, alongside these critiques, ecofeminism very much values care, but care as work on which all life depends. It's very much concerned with interdependence, relationality, and symbiosis. Care is an important element of ecofeminist thinking. It's really about the unpaid, underpaid, and undervalued work, and typically feminized work of care that maintains human societies and that brings those who do it in close contact with the environment. So care not only as an ethic and a feeling, but as a practice and a form of work. But of course, care ethics are extremely important and seen as needed to repair the relationships that have been destroyed by values that underpin patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and speciesism. Very brief. So, but my interest then to think about rewilding through an ecofeminist lens was sparked a couple of years ago when I went to a workshop organized actually at the University of Exeter, and the result of which was a special issue of Area, which is the Royal Geographical Society journal, and I wrote a short commentary for it. Maybe the link will be in the chat. At that workshop, we discussed many ways that rewilding appears to be gendered, that it appears to be about keeping humans separate from nature, and that it celebrates expert knowledge in ways that run counter to justice. And here are some images of rewilding as it presents itself from the internet. It's very interesting to look at these images and see how advocates want us to think about it. There's lots of scope here for critical questioning. Who's involved? Who's missing? Where does it happen? How does it shape or seek to shape people's relationships with nature? Which people? Which nature? Ecofeminist research tends to take a very qualitative and ethnographic approach, interested in talking to people on the ground who are seldom heard from, the local people living in and tending to the land, as opposed to people enjoying it on a bicycle or through a binocular lens. In the special issue, there were a number of case studies that came from this ethnographic research, including from the Cow Valley in Portugal and the Cambrian Mountains of Wales. And I want to talk about three examples, and one is actually not from the special issue, but from another excellent ecofeminist case study that comes from a PhD thesis that I'm supervising about rewilding in the Scottish Highlands. And it's from this, from Heather Urquhart's research that I give you my first example and critical question. Heather's line of questioning and critique is about whether rewilding in many cases is a continuation of human and in particular men's mastery of nature while being hidden behind a pretense of caring about nature. Can have a look at the vision statements on the Wildland website, and Wildland is a company involved in rewilding huge amounts of the Scottish Highlands. And if you look at it, you can see it claims to be helping nature heal, rebirthing new wilderness, taking responsibility as custodians to care for sheep-wrecked and empty landscapes. Of course, the reality is that the owner of Wildland is a billionaire from Denmark who is the largest landowner in Scotland and is selling nature experiences to other rich people under the guise of ecotourism, very much to the annoyance of local crofting communities. And this extract from a poem illustrates it very nicely. Heather's research has coined the phrase mastery rewilding, and from an ecofeminist perspective, she exposes the hypocrisy and care washing of the green lairds. She writes, a laird-driven approach to rewilding allows the wealthy men destroying nature to emerge as its panacea. Wealthy men like ASOS owner Anders Poulsen, who made his fortune in fast fashion and is now Scotland's largest landowner, can declare himself custodian of the land and implement his own 200-year vision to rewild Scotland. This approach allows lairds to act as masters of nature, changing landscapes according to their vision and making decisions about what life gets to flourish. So with very stark inequalities in power, profit, and responsibility, the issue of distributive justice is relevant here. Who benefits and who loses is very clear. My second critique and question is about devaluing the unassuming everyday work of caring for the land that local people do. So the crofters, the subsistence farmers, and the forest dwellers. In a case study by Nadia Bartolini and colleagues, they have their curiosity about the socioeconomic impacts of rewilding of Portugal's Coa Valley led them to do ethnographic research. And their initial encounters in their research was mostly with men working in rewilding projects. This led them to then seek out women who are mainly located on the margins of rewilding. And their interviews with women who were involved in rewilding helped them to learn about these experiences and to understand how rewilding projects are affecting women's lives and relations with the land. And one thing that they found is that in the rewilding projects that they looked at, there's a tendency to devalue and disregard the connections with land that women have from years of productive work tending to land and producing food and income for families. This work, and I guess in a way, this work really kind of has to be ignored so that the land can be narrativized as empty, desolate, and economically deprived in order to justify the imposition of rewilding projects. They write, rewilding is more than about nature conservation, animal reintroductions, and dealing with conflict over land use. It is about how women use their knowledge, expertise, and agency to create futures for their families. If we ignore these voices, we miss how rewilding is more than nature, its management and practices. There is a human component in rewilding that links people and nature. So including voices less heard is very relevant to participatory or procedural justice, and this is about ensuring that decisions are fair and made in an inclusive way. And the point really here is that any conservation project is unlikely to have just outcomes if the process excludes people with direct relationships to the land. This links to the final example I'll give, which is related to the last, and it's about devaluing and even misrecognizing the knowledge that comes from close and caring relationships with the land, which could be called embodied knowledge, local knowledge. In some circles, it might be called traditional ecological knowledge. And here I give the example from research that farmer and an academic, Fionn Jones, that when she writes about the Summit to Sea project, which was a flagship project of Rewilding Britain that was initiated in Wales in 2018 and then suspended soon after in 2019. Jones suggests how Rewilding Britain's neglect of the differences between their knowledge and local inhabitants' knowledge, along with the repeated vilification of farming by one of the founders of Rewilding Britain, whose name everyone probably knows, and their naivete about the socio-political importance of Wales's upland environment all led to the failure to establish the Summit to Sea Rewilding project. Writing eloquently about the caring that goes into sheep farming and the close relationship of hill farmers to the land, she stresses that family farming involves generational repetition of practices of care and animal husbandry. It is literally a weaving together of human and animal relationships over time.
Sherilyn, 1 minute.
Okay, so if I have 1 minute, then I won't be reading Fionn's quote here. But again, it's about really listening to the knowledge coming from the farmers who are working the land. So to conclude then, I want to just say that I've tried to convey how an eco-feminist critique of rewilding really questions rewilding's support for human connections to nature and really tries to identify potential forms of injustice, so distribution, procedure, and epistemic injustice if we think about how knowledge has been sidelined. And so just to sort of finish then, it's always good to follow critiques with some alternatives and what I would think is involved in imagining more just and careful relations. So there's 4 takeaways. These are, one is transcend these binaries, try to think about rejecting the wild, non-wild distinction, reject the master model. Important to think about centering care as both work and feeling, to call out care washing, value and promote everyday earth care and the knowledge that it's gained from it. Listen to and include those with knowledge gained from caring for nature, and to repair relationships and foster connections everywhere. So interactions with nature for all, not conservation of remote land for the enjoyment of an elite few. That very much links to the arguments that Nadia makes, and I'm interested to hear what people will make of my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. If you could stop sharing, that's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A. Thank you for these fantastic provocations. Quite a lot there, but also quite a lot of parallels or even connections between them too, which is fantastic. I mean, to summarize, for me, is going to be a difficult task here. What I would say is that We've had various suggestions. First one from Nadia suggesting we should really think carefully about potentially, who knows, recommoning the countryside in some ways or another, but at least, foregrounding the issue of class not just as an economic category, but as a cultural kind of category as well. And then we had Rupert's provocation telling us a great deal about, what might be the problem with the notion of justice that we've had so far that has been used as a frame of reference with the way we understand the relationship between humanity and nature, and a suggestion to move away from it in order to address some really important environmental matters. And then Sherilyn telling us a great deal about, some of the inherent problems potentially with the rewilding discourse that tends to dominate today in the UK. Okay, so we've got a few questions from the audience. Please do not hesitate to add your questions to the Q&A, everyone. So the first question, it's been put in the answered bit, so let me have a look. So it's a question for Rupert. Thank you for your provocation. I know Rupert's answered it in writing, but if Rupert could come in and answer it as well, that would be fantastic. So you've certainly provoked a lot of thoughts for him, for them. So I'd like to better understand what exactly you're arguing against. The definition for justice in the context of your talk: simply legalistic justice in terms of upholding the law, or in terms of ensuring equal opportunities for everyone, or entirely different altogether?
Yeah. So a full answer would obviously take a long time. What I was trying to suggest was that our concept of justice is based in paradigms that occur between human beings in the present day. So the law court is a very obvious such paradigm. There are other paradigms available now, such as the very widespread notion of distributive justice, which is very influential in political philosophy. My claim is that when you try to extend this concept to non-human animals, to future generations, and I mentioned some other limitations as well, then, well, you pretty quickly run into severe limitations. That the concept of distributive justice can't really help us if what we're talking about is beings that don't exist yet. We don't know who they're going to be. Their very existence depends upon what we decide to distribute, create, etc., etc. And that while there are contexts in which it could make sense, I allowed for the concept of justice to be applied to non-human animals, I think that most of the time it's going to be a bit of a stretch and it's going to mislead us. And fundamentally, the claim comes down to saying the concept of justice is thoroughgoingly anthropocentric. And if we really want to take biodiversity seriously, we ought to think beyond it. In this context, by the way, let me just add very briefly, if I may, that I'm a big fan, as some of you might have gathered, of ecofeminism. It's been a huge influence on me. But I don't agree with the claim I think I heard Sherilyn make that we should abandon the binary between the wild and the non-wild. I think that is a distinction that sometimes has purchase. And that when it comes to the wild, when it comes to environments where human beings are largely or even completely absent, that the concept of justice just runs out of road.
Thank you, Rupert. Sherilyn, would you like to respond maybe for this instance?
Well, yes, I think that my last slide was going to be a quote actually from a philosopher that's really shaped my thinking about the wild and the non-wild. Kyle Powis White, who's got an excellent article called "Why Does Anything Need to Be Called Wild?" And this comes from an indigenous perspective, North American indigenous perspective, about that wild is actually a settler colonial concept that was imposed upon people and land in the so-called New World. And he thinks that it absolutely runs counter to an understanding of human nature relationships that's rooted in a different kind of cosmology, different kind of ontology. And I think ecofeminists have learned a lot from those types of critiques, including myself. So I highly recommend it as an article for people to read.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. Now a question for Nadia. So Nadia, if you're there, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the most important thing that needs to change in combating classism in the use of nature? Can you give examples of anything that has worked to challenge this?
I think fundamentally it comes down to um, challenging those niggles or belief that comes to mind um, when we think about people as a threat, like individual people, not systems, um, not all of the academic words I'm hearing, but people being in and amongst where there are beavers and where there are bitterns and where there are birds of prey. And when we feel threatened by that, that's the work that we've got to do to challenge ourselves and go, why am I threatened? Because actually, um, we do have to love all people again. And I think the what happens to a human when they grow up or spend time in nature and have a connection is a very, very beautiful thing. What happens to humans when they grow up feeling that they don't belong and they're not in it produces behaviors that we then go, well, that's a problem. Um, and and I think that that's where we do have to do just a little bit of personal work of just go like everybody um, is already absolutely fine and perfect as the way they are, but there is potential for learning and to be better. And that feels like a problem of like terrifying proportions. You know, taking 60 million people by the hand and going, this place is for you, and spend some time here and learn to love it in a way that makes sense to you. That feels like work that it's probably easier to not do. Maybe we'll fix the nature problem first, and then hopefully at some theoretical place in the future, we can then let the population loose when somehow it's learned how to behave and to care, and also has agency and time to do that care. Um, and yeah, I mean, hopefully that makes sense, you know, because we are all one in the same, really. We've just had different life experiences. Um, and and that's from those little niggles of like, oh, what, when people have learned to behave and people need responsibility, to also the deeper misanthropic views that I hear in rooms, in meetings where people are like, oh, the townies are going to come in, or urban people don't really know. Um, I mean, that's a hard challenge, because that was me. I would go camping in the woods and leave fag ends and leave beer bottles. Um, I was probably the worst kind of person. Um, Now I'd like to think that I would, do the right thing, but I would also, um, I also love fiercely people like me, um, from
Thank you.
giving my age away a few decades ago.
Thank you very much, Nadia. There seems to be a, oh, Sharon, you want to
Just
come in?
wanted to really,
Yeah.
really briefly support that and say that because Nadia and I both mentioned the study by Miles Richardson at the University of Derby about nature connectedness, that he doesn't actually, as far as what I've read, doesn't talk about rewilding. He talks about urban greening, bringing nature into the city, forests, schools, urban parks, alley greening, all of these things that bring nature to people and to foster connection, rather than thinking that it needs to be somewhere remote and far away.
And it seems that Rupert wants to come in as well. And it seems to be a very strong connection between those three talks, and this emphasis on care and love being central to those connections. So, Rupert.
Yeah, absolutely. But, let me be a little bit provocative. If I see fag ends in nature, it hurts me. And I have thoughts about the people who left them. I don't think things like, I hate them and want to kill them, but I do think things like they shouldn't do that and this is wrong. And I think it's wrong to imply that it's wrong for me to think or feel that way. And in terms of the point about, yeah, absolutely, totally, greening cities, et cetera, absolutely brilliant. Uh, but I mean, the point I was trying to make about the wild earlier, I mean, I wonder if there's a semantic issue there really between me and Sherilyn, because of course, many indigenous peoples have, for example, had notions like story places, which are places you're not supposed to go into. And that seems to me to be an idea which makes perfect sense, that maybe it's appropriate for human beings not to tramp absolutely everywhere, even if they leave no trace. And it seems to me we ought to be open to all such possibilities, especially now.
Thank you, Rupert. Nadia.
Hopefully it's okay just to come back. Yes, and I think grief is valid. So you see pain in nature and litter, and then your grief is valid, and it's how we process that grief, which we don't know how to do appropriately as a culture, because
Yeah, I
once you
agree.
process it, it comes out as love.
Yeah,
Appropriately,
absolutely.
that's how it comes out.
Yeah.
And I do think though that there are naturally wild places, even within indigenous communities, where land is cultivated and lived in alongside nature, which we can take lessons from. But they are community driven wild places that people decide on a community basis together, let's leave that bit wild. And it's not
Mm.
it's the top down wildness that's the problem, because it makes no sense when that's imposed on somebody, I think, meaningfully, to make it a workable solution.
Hmm.
Very much. It's just brilliant to see all those connections and those dialogues. Going back to the questions from the audience. So again, a question that you've answered in writing, Rupert, but that's a question for Rupert, but could be a question for Sherilyn as well. I was wondering what you thought about the emphasis in strands of Black and feminist thought on anger and rage. And by the way, this could be for the three of you potentially, if you want to answer as well, as an important mobilizing force when seeing political transformation. Are you worried about expressions of anger in environmentalism? Or do you think your emphasis on care, love leaves room for anger in environmentalism? Sherilyn, would you like to maybe come in first? Because, Rupert's just, and maybe have Rupert and maybe Nadia if you want to come in.
Well, I mean, depends whether we want to talk about philosophy or activism, and maybe no one wants to see a huge difference between them. And I think anger and rage is an important place in activism and driving activism. And by the same token, the word justice and calling out injustices also has a extremely important place in mobilizing people to demand change. So, as someone who's always been interested in environmentalisms as movements, as social movements, political movements, I think we don't want to all retreat into calling for love and care and thinking things will be fine if we just commune with nature. So, yes, I guess I would say I'd like to see anger and rage, as long as it's placed in a way that advocates transformation that is democratic and breaks down and addresses the structural inequalities that are the root causes of the problem.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Rupert, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to elaborate on what I said in writing, I think I agree with what Sherilyn just said. There's totally a place for anger and rage. My concern is that we tend in our politics to center anger and rage at the expense of everything else, which I think is, among other things, a kind of gendered way of approaching politics, including environmental politics. I think there's an absolutely fundamental role for other emotions, including despair, including shame and guilt, including perhaps above all grief. And that when we take seriously the full roster of human emotions and bring ourselves as whole beings to what we're dealing with here, then it's much more sophisticated, it's much more embodied, and it tends to be less justice fixated. Because there's this kind of stereotype in politics of what politics is about, and it's similar in most activism, is there's been an injustice. We have to right this injustice. Until we do, we're going to be angry and we're going to rage at the other side and create polarization and so forth. And there's totally space for that. But there's also totally space for other approaches which are less polarizing, for other approaches which actually reach deeper into what we care about and how we're related to each other and to nature and to our homes.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you. Nadia, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, anger is a secondary emotion to something else. And I think
Mm.
we look at this on like this big, what Rupert was just saying, like on a political level, but let's talk about like a room with 4 people having a meeting about something. And if somebody's angry, there is just like some basic ways. I think that I found working in the nature conservation sector, there was like a professionalism or a way that you had to show up, that I don't think addressed anger, which is secondary usually to grief, or I've not been heard, or I don't understand. And there's just the reality of how we operate on a human level with one another. And it's just, I think it's just, I think individually I've got a I mean, I get angry. I've got a personal role to process my anger and go, how do I'm going to go away, and then I'm going to come back and go, I'd like to talk about this thing that happened. This idea I gave wasn't heard, or, or just be able to talk about it. I don't think, I think anger has a place if everyone around helps you go, what are you angry about? Let's talk about it. Don't think it, sometimes it's as simple as that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And since care and love is really something quite central, it seems, to the 3 provocations in some ways, I'm going to take the liberty of asking this question to you all, really, to end this Q&A as well. You've got 2 questions on love and care. So the first one would be, how can the concepts of care and love for biodiversity become policy for our political institutions who take the economic utilitarian perspective in making decisions? And the second question is there not a risk by looking at it from this, from the perspective of care and love, or relying on those emotions to kind of make it too individualistic potentially as an approach to the issues that we're discussing here? So yeah, who would like to answer? Maybe Rupert, do you want to start with
I'd love to start on that, because I don't agree that it's that love or care is individualistic. I think Sherilyn would agree that when we understand care deeply and look at historical precedents for it, it's prototypically socially shared, intersubjective, etc., etc. And when one takes love seriously, what one's really doing is noticing and building a field of deep relationality, or what my teacher Thich Nhat Hanh used to call interbeing. So I think it's really the opposite of individualistic, and we only think it's individualistic because we've been subject to ludicrous ideological propaganda about your feelings are internal, they're yours alone, they're nothing to do with kind of being connected to the world or other people, which, when you think about it, is a completely ludicrous way of thinking about what emotions actually are. They are what bind us together and make us a superorganism.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you. Sherilyn, would you like to come in?
Yes, I think I've lost track of what the question was actually getting at, but I guess I would just hope people would leave this conversation aware that when ecofeminists talk about care and love, I mean, we talk about practice and work and effort and the things people do to survive collectively. And without that interdependence, without that taking care of each other, we wouldn't have survived as a species. And it is a very devalued practice. It's undervalued, it's under recognized. Of course, during the pandemic, we said, oh, it's essential work. But then we revert back to taking it for granted. And whether that's people taking care of each other in a care home, or people taking care of the land as farmers, we just don't value it enough. So I hope that we can talk about feelings of love and care and ethics of love and care, but let's not forget that it comes from a practice and the everyday relationships that we have to navigate.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. And Nadia, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I've got really derailed because, Rupert, how are you typing so fast in the chat at the same time? I'm trying to read that and process.
I've been typing these comments for the whole of the last hour. Is the answer?
So I don't know how to kind of. There's a lot there that I agree that you said and what Sherilyn said, and I think ultimately what, when it comes to the care that the environment needs, it's so place-based. It's literally planting a tree or behaving in a physical space appropriately. And so, how do we understand that when we have love and care for people around us and think, okay, we need to create a sense of community here where we all agree a certain way of being and relating to the natural environment that we all kind of sign up to and go, yeah, this is how we as a community care for this environment, give it space, take resources and be. These are all just, it all comes down to relational moments of individuals within a community, because you can create a rewilded landscape or etc., but it's the people actually on the ground doing things that makes a difference. But trying then to relate it to policies and bigger systems to feed into that, so when it gets to the community can do that love and care work. That's the hard piece that I think we struggle with, because we can go, oh yeah, you know, we need to listen to people, empower people, you know, love people that have been disconnected, and listen and have what was in the chat. Emotional literacy is really important, but so many of us work in big policy, and it just goes this whoosh, leap to then how does that come and translate down? And I think that that's just where the work is, which is the work that I think, you know, I do with Right to Roam, is to fundamentally fix a root of that problem.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our provocateurs. It's been a really inspiring session. Absolutely thought-provoking for sure too.